I'm Jesse Rouse. I'm with the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and today I'm going to be talking about digital geographies because hopefully all of us are excited about geography. We're all, of course, interested in spatial, geospatial, and I also do a podcast on the side called Very Spatial, and just this past weekend we talked, or a couple of us talked to David Goodchild. So if you've gone through an undergrad program or master's program, you know who he is, kind of the big person who helped, was part of that intro level of geographic information science. And one of the things that he said in the 10 minutes that we talked to him was, it's geography. GIS is great, but if we don't understand the geography behind it, it makes it a little bit difficult to really understand what we're understanding through our technologies. In addition, though, we're also looking at a broader array of digital technologies than before. Yes, we still utilize GIS. GIS is the backbone of course, what we think of as digital whenever we're talking about geography. And whenever we're looking at these technologies, of course, we know the idea of the 5 points of the star. We're storing, we're sharing, we're representing the information. But there's also the ideas that came through from GI science that began in the 1990s and continue today and are part of both the idea of digital geographies as well as some of these other ideas that are continuing to push GIS forward as a technology. So everything from privacy to SDI to things like participatory GIS. These are all things that we kind of think about whenever we're thinking of GIS. But we're also moving more and more into areas of qualitative GIS, where we have some of these different ideas, mixed methods coming through, things that help us understand qualitative information from media to text to representations of everything from gender to inequality to just how we represent the information. So we're seeing these things come through ever more quickly with the current movements. And of course, with geospatial technologies, us moving from talking about our different stacks as GIS, remote sensing, location-based technologies, GNSS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we've now put them under this nice branding that help us to pull them together, and whenever we're going and talking to clients or communities, we don't have to list out this long litany of technologies. We can just kind of put it under an umbrella. Now, at some points, of course, that does us a little bit of disservice because we're not informing the communities, our clients, exactly of what they're getting into, but at the same time, it helps us motivate the conversation, move it along a little bit. But moving from some of these traditional GIS ideas, we have lots of different technologies that we're moving into. And we're taking these technologies, and we'll talk about those in just a second, but the important part here is that we're keeping this idea of geography. All of these are being pushed forward by the digital turn. Now, of course, for us, coming to a conference like the NCGIS conference, we understand the digital turn. We turned with it. We went along with the digital, whether we're talking about using geography, for biology, for environmental science, for physics. We are those people who jumped on board and kind of followed that train, but there were a lot of geographers, and a couple of my professors in grad school were those geographers who were a little bit hesitant to look at anything digital. They were a little questioning of email. So the fact that we're beginning to talk more and more about digital geographies over the last decade, when GIS has, of course, been around for almost 5 decades. Did I do my math right? 2019 minus 69. Is that 50 years? Okay. So as we're approaching 50 years, or just hit it somewhere in that area, with some of the larger name software at least, we're adopting the same type of turn that we've seen in other disciplines. Many of you may have heard of ideas like digital humanities. It's a big push right now, looking from anthropology to archaeology, art history to history. My background is in archaeology. One of the big things that I was interested in using GIS for early on was to bring digital into archaeology. It kind of swept me up into the geography aspects. But as we look at all these other disciplines, over the last 30, 40 years, they've begun to see a digital turn. And of course, that goes along with us having access to these digital technologies. Within geography itself, just a couple of years ago, or just last year actually, Ash, Kitchen, and Lazinski noted that geographies that are produced through, produced by, and of digital are what we're generally talking about as digital geographies now. So whenever we look at this idea of digital geography, we're talking about our move into the digital turn, and we're looking at those things that are produced through, by, and of digital geography, or the digital. So how do we break this down a little bit? Well, again, we have different aspects. We have the quantitative, in terms of quantitative geography. We have qualitative. So I'm going to start with quantitative. It's where we're a little bit more comfortable. It's a lot more connected to our traditional GIS. And in fact, my first thing is going to be GIS remote sensing. Again, we can toss in there location-based services and all of the others where we have a stream of zeros and ones, these ideas that we're very comfortable with, looking at geography as part of the digital. Moving on then to geovisualization. Now, over the last couple of decades, we've been talking about that coming directly out of the idea of GIS. But as we'll talk about at the end of qualitative approaches, we have, of course, much more recent pushes towards 3D and virtual environments, augmented reality, where we are using these digital quantitative approaches for a much more qualitative conversation. Big data. And of course, as I continue to say whenever we talk about this, is we've been big data since before there was big data. We've just been talking about it as geospatial data. And of course, it brings us a whole wealth of activities whenever we're talking about everything from analysis through R to capturing through Hadoop and other technologies. And of course, we're moving more and more into the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which of course is entirely quantitative, taking advantage of these big data stacks and access to an amazing amount of information, both big data and small data, to try to parse out new types of knowledge. So whenever we look at this, GIS, of course, is our very traditional idea of quantitative approaches. Here we have a very simple floodplain, a parcel. What portion of this parcel is in floodplain? Which portion is already in agriculture? So we can go through and do a quick remote sensing analysis to figure out which portions of this parcel are forested versus farm area or grassland. All types of things that we can throw at this, very simple, very straightforward GIS and quantitative in our approach to it. In terms of geovisualization, something as simple as taking the time of day and looking at our understanding of a place through geovisualization based on that time of day and how it can change. And of course, whenever we get into the idea of qualitative aspects, our responses to those change in time of day. Of course, big data, where we're talking about bringing these massive amounts of information together, everything from clouds of information from social media to point clouds of representations of data that's being collected real time or in static models. So as we're looking at quantitative approaches, they're really kind of what we expect when we're talking about GIS. And it's the tradition that we've been moving through. And these are still coming along with digital geography, but one of the things that is different is, other than the GIS slide, none of these are using explicitly GIS software. Some of these are still bringing in aspects of projection. They're still bringing in ideas of representation. But as we look at them, we're looking at things like spatial Hadoop. We're using online web-based interfaces that are doing mental mapping as opposed to traditional mapping. As we look at qualitative approaches, we get even further away from some of our traditional software applications. As we look through interviews and survey responses, we're using text-based analysis. We're looking at relationships, much like we saw in the big data image for LinkedIn and the social media connections. We're looking for things like sentiment that we've never been able to really capture very well in a traditional GIS. We talked about it as part of GIS 2, but really has never made it in through very tight coupling. Whenever we look at things like social media, we're talking about audio, video, user-generated content on a much grander scale than we ever have before. Of course, we have the conversations of things like volunteer geographic information. Spatial narratives, we all know these now as story maps. And of course, experiences such as immersive visualization, whether we're talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, where we can put people not in the map, but in the world. Here's just a quick series of pictures. These are all of the same object. It's a Mycenaean site in Greece where we went through, took a lot of pictures using structure from motion. So a close-range photogrammetry technique, and created a 3D model from these various photographs. Now, if this was animated, it'd make a little more sense, but trust me, it's 3D, and you can move around in it. As we look at spatial narratives, everything from a simple look at a representation of climate all the way through to story maps that almost have no maps. So if you've been looking at, for instance, Esri's Story Map Gallery, there's a lot of them where you just don't have a map unless it's a historic map. So we're moving away from the map having to be the central linchpin in some of these narratives to recognizing the fact that we have narratives that exist in space that we don't necessarily need to have a map to convey this narrative. And here we have 3 pictures. One, just a static picture. The second one, a 360 picture. Sorry. We're seeing all the way around, even though it's not animated, so you can't see the sphere aspect of it, and a 3D model or virtual world. So whether we're talking about experiences indoors, which again, with the GIS, we're limited a lot of times in what we talk about with our experience, our mapping, a lot of times to our outdoor experiences, our large area experiences. With virtual reality, we can stick with those, or we can actually move into a lot of smaller experiences. And here we're moving into much more stronger relationships with things like building information models, but even things like video game engines that this is built in. Unity, for instance, allows us to move forward. So as we come to the end then, we're talking about digital geography and looking at it as a representation of how we approach theory and geography. Again, with GIS, we moved into GI science to be able to bring that idea of theory in. Instead, with digital geographies, it's generally coming from someone who has a very specific theory or methodology in mind and begins to bring in technologies that are appropriate to that theory or methodology. So it's a little bit of a different approach, as opposed to starting with the GIS, starting with the theory and coming in. Of course, our representation, we saw geovisualization, of course, has been around for a very long time. VR, AR has been around for a very long time, but we're seeing new ideas of what needs to be represented coming through in these theoretical approaches that are utilizing digital geographies that are going beyond, again, our idea of GIS. And of course, interpretation. In interpretation, we kind of make the map. Sometimes portions of that map are our interpretation, but then we release that to the public. We don't do a lot other than creating a textual interpretation of our map to share it. Now we're beginning to see the interpretation in the map itself, or in the product itself. So as we started, digital geographies are geography, but bringing in the digital. So going a little bit different direction than we have traditionally with GIS, moving into geography, but taking the geography and bringing us out into the digital. So again, it started with our digital turn. We started that with GIS, but we've really gone in very heavily over the last decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, with different technologies, bringing them in to support different theoretical approaches. And of course, as Ash, Kitchen, and Lazitsky says, it's produced by, produced through, and of the digital. And I believe I'm out of time. Okay. Any questions? Okay, I think we have the plenary getting ready to start in about 10 minutes down the hall. Got cut a little bit short thanks to the technical issues, but I rushed through. Let me know if you do have any questions later on, and I'll be happy to answer them by email, or I'll be downstairs. Check out the North Carolina Geographical Society booth in the exhibit hall and become a member.